Please be seated, everyone. Sorry about that. That just made a more confusing reading even more confusing. But before we get into it, I feel like, and it's because y'all said this out loud, you read this together. A congregation doesn't usually read Psalm 137 out loud. Andrea's like, no, we don't do that. And I think because at the heart of that psalm is not just tragedy, but it's death, it's vengeance, it's a wound, it's a very, very deep wound that the Hebrew people are tending to in that moment through words and through lament. And so for us to say that out loud as a congregation, I imagine, particularly as you read those last verses, that you were like, oh, yeah. It's a very intense psalm. But here's the thing. Sometimes we don't choose the readings we've been given. They're given to us to wrestle with, to connect to what we see, perhaps on the news, to see what's happening in our world, to connect to our lives in faith and what's going on in our own diocese. And so that's there this weekend. And along with it is this request from the apostles to increase their faith. The apostles say to Jesus, increase our faith, Lord. And that sounds like a familiar request to me. I think some of us in this life, some of us want and we desire more faith because faith seems to be the fuel we need to do what Jesus asks of us, especially when his commands seem impossible. So in the face of that psalm, increase our faith. This is especially true if you take into consideration what comes before the reading in Luke. The verses that directly precede this reading in the gospel, they concern forgiveness. And in essence, what is said, if your brother sins against you 7 times a day and turns back to you 7 times a day and says, I repent, you must forgive. You must forgive. And so no wonder, in the face of that, they say, Jesus, increase our faith. It's hard to forgive when we feel wronged. It's hard to forgive when we've been disrespected and abused. But Jesus doesn't lecture his disciples. He doesn't lecture them on the way that they should feel. Instead, he offers them this image, seemingly out of nowhere. If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. I imagine they must have looked at Jesus in that moment and been like, what? Jesus, let's get back to this forgiveness thing that you were just telling me that I have to do. Increase our faith. Instead of that, Jesus tells them a second story that I couldn't even read. He tells a story about a servant who works all day and then must prepare the master's meal without thanks. And these 2 short parables, all the commentaries that I read in preparation for this, talk about how they're very short parables. They're challenging for us because they're not images that we readily work with in our own lives, but yet they relate to our our notions of faith and power and service. The caveat is I think if we stick with Jesus in this, if we just hold on a little bit longer, I think these stories unlock something essential about forgiveness. And how forgiveness might lead to us sharing our faith. And dare I say, evangelism. And that's something that took center stage at convention this weekend at St. Crispin's. That theme kept reoccurring over and over the past couple of days. That our faith is to be lived. It's to be demonstrated. And so in Luke, I don't think Jesus is deliberately disengaging from the disciples' request to increase their faith. What I think Jesus is doing is he's redefining what faith is for them. Faith, in other words, is not about quantity, like a big sack that you can just keep adding to, right? Rather, it's all about one's orientation and trust. Thus, a mustard seed of faith is all you need. Because it's not about your own strength. It's about God's strength. And that's because faith connects us to God's creative energy. And we don't need to rely all on our own. That was convention, I think, in a nutshell. You agree, Chris? Maybe. It was really about evangelism. And I thought about how I might connect that to the really challenging readings that we had today. And the major focus there was not about convincing others so that we might add to our number, right? That's not what evangelism in that sense was about. But it was about sharing our faith. It's about inviting people into that same orientation and trust with us. When we share that, we are not handing out something that we already own. We are bearing witness to what God is already doing in the world. And we are saying, we have eyes to see that in you. That insight, I think, reframes the apostles' plea to increase our faith. It becomes less about gaining something, but more about growing in an awareness of God's presence already at work in people's lives. It is not give us more faith, Jesus, but teach us to live more faithfully. And so evangelism then becomes less about persuasion and more about participation, joining God's mission of reconciling love and helping others recognize that they already live within that system. This weekend, someone said, evangelism is not about getting people to church. It's about getting the church to people. I wrote that down. And that's because even when faith is small then, the size of a mustard seed, it's alive. It moves. It moves outwardly, quietly, stubbornly sometimes, often miraculously, into the sea of human need. And that, my friends, is where God needs his church to be. In the depth of human need. And so we get the story of the servant then. The servant who, after doing all his tasks, does not expect thanks. And I think at first when we read that story, if we can get through it, it may seem harsh and even dismissive. That's the way it hits us in the face sometimes. But I don't think Jesus is describing God as an ungrateful master, even if he's trying to do that. I think he's trying to show his disciples what humility looks like. what humility looks like in a life of faith. Faithful disciples, like you all, do not perform acts of service to earn divine approval. I think you act out of gratitude for the grace that you've already been given. And so forgiveness, likewise, is not a transaction that requires reciprocity. I think it's an expression of freedom. We forgive not because others always deserve it, but because we are servants of the one whose mercy defines a new reality, that we have been forgiven too. I think the sharing of our faith must flow from this perspective. We must adopt postures of humility, much like the one that's on your front cover, where Jesus took off his outer robe, knelt down, and washed his disciples' feet. We do not share our faith to gain applause in the public sphere or to prove our own righteousness. I think we share it because love compels us to do so. And evangelism that begins with that kind of humility reflects, I think, the self-giving nature of Christ. And that is always putting our best foot forward. And when Jesus says, "So you also, when you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are worthless servants. We have done only what we ought to have done.'" I think in a way he is freeing the disciples from the illusion that their faith will somehow earn them status. In a world obsessed with recognition and your productivity, this is liberating news. The gospel is not another ladder for us to climb. It's a grace that we receive and we share. And I think the thread that ties all of this together, if there is one, that ties evangelism and forgiveness and convention and faith, I think that thread is humility. One presenter summed it up beautifully. Evangelism is not pointing out to people what they lack. It's reminding them of who they already are, beloved children of Jesus. That is what Jesus asks of them when the disciples say, "Increase our faith." To trust that you are a beloved child of God. Trust, he says, in the tiniest seed of faith, that this can grow into the mightiest acts of mercy. Serve without seeking reward. Forgive as you have been forgiven. Proclaim not yourselves, but the grace of God. I think when we live that way, evangelism ceases to be a program. It becomes a way of life. It is faith that is embodied. It is the good news made visible. In every humble act of love, a seed is planted, I think. And so when someone will ask me, what was the 88th convention all about? I will say that the seeds of love are ready for harvest. And the reaping begins with sharing God's love.